This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On July the 13th, author Don Levers joined Military History Night live via Zoom to present on the theme Winnipeg's If Day and other what-if moments of the Second World War. Even if you are deeply knowledgeable about the subject, this talk may cause you to take a moment to wonder, what if?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patricia Hind-White. I organize and coordinate this event. Welcome to the virtual RCMI Military History Night, Wednesday, July the 13th, 2022. This presentation will be videotaped for educational purposes and available on RCMI YouTube. There'll be a question and answer period following Don's presentation, and please mute your mics and turn off the camera until that time. Our guest speaker this evening is author Don Levers, and his topic, Winnipeg's If Day and other what-if moments of World War II. One of the oddest vignettes of the home front during World War II is the story of Winnipeg's If Day. This incredible story took place in 1942 to help raise funds for victim funds. The question was, what if the Nazis invaded Canada? Our speaker, who now resides in Sturgeon County, Alberta, raised in the Fraserview area of Vancouver, British Columbia, and a longtime member of the Royal Canadian Army Cadets in Vancouver. He spent time with the Vancouver Police Reserves and was a volunteer firefighter while living in the Okanagan, and elected 3 times as a director of the Central Okanagan Regional District. In 2019, Don attended the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and after telling a local news anchor about his trip, the host remarked that it would be great to walk in his father's footsteps. In February, Don's new book, His Father's Footsteps, Stories of World War II Veterans, What If Moments, was released. And Don has donated a copy of his book to RCMI Library. Thank you again, Don.
You're welcome, thank you.
Now, even those who are very knowledgeable about World War II, I think they'll find that Don's presentation this evening will give you cause to wonder, what if? And that being said, and without further ado, warm welcome, Don, and virtually speaking, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pat. Well, before I begin, I want to thank Pat and the Royal Canadian Military Institute for allowing me to make tonight's presentation. It's a real honor to be here, and I wish we could be doing something like this in person. I also want to acknowledge Eric Morris for taking an interest in one of my Facebook posts about If Day and helping me make tonight possible. Finally, I want to say thank you to a wonderful group that I traveled to Normandy with for the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Some of them have or will be joining us tonight, and it was a trip that I will always remember, and one of the items that I was able to fulfill on my bucket list. If I was doing this in person, I'd ask you to stand to be recognized if you've ever been a member of the regular forces, the reserves, the police, or any other first responders. There are certainly a lot of overused expressions for the work you do and have continued to do, and tonight I hope a simple thank you will suffice. How many here tonight had relatives that served in World War I or II? What about Korea or Vietnam, or any of the other conflicts that Canadians have been involved with throughout the world, including Bosnia, the First Gulf War, or Afghanistan, to name a few? Did you know that as many as 30,000 Canadians volunteered to go to Vietnam? I'd also like to welcome a couple of tonight's participants who served in the US military. I'm sure they had their own what-if moments in their careers. Is there anyone here with family members? Because I was talking about your services earlier, but I wonder if there's anyone with family members that were involved in any cadet corps programs. To you, I also want to say thank you. I don't think of these programs as a training ground for new generations of soldiers. I feel as a training ground for a new generation of upstanding citizens. I was proud to myself have been involved with the cadet movement for over 5 years. Has anyone here tonight seen the presentation by Ted Barris and David O'Keefe? If you haven't, I encourage you to see them live on stage. They put on an incredible performance, inspired by their books and interviews with hundreds, perhaps thousands of veterans. As an author and a storyteller, the ability to keep an audience engaged in your story and wanting more is one of the goals I have set for myself. Tonight is my inaugural presentation to a larger group. Call it my dress rehearsal, if you will. And as with any dress rehearsal, there are occasionally glitches to overcome. Still, I hope you find tonight an enjoyable experience. And if my presentation encourages you to delve further into your own family's military experiences, I will have done my job. One of the most famous questions of all time is to be or not to be. That is the question. I think there is a much simpler one. What if? To me, that is a question we can all ask ourselves throughout our lives. Now, many historical accounts by authors about war look at the big picture of an entire war or individual battles, and even the generals. Our Father's Footsteps is a micro look at the lives of 4 average men who volunteered to serve their countries during World War II. These men had one thing in common. They all landed on Normandy's beaches on June 6, 1944. I've used family history books, letters, telegrams, and journals, and regimental war diaries to tell the stories of these 4 ordinary men. They were caught up in the extraordinary circumstances of a world at war and survived what I call their what-if moments. If we have time at the end of the presentation, I have some new information about this famous picture on the cover of my book. If you have time, I encourage you to visit my website, donleversbooks.com. My site includes a short book trailer we produced for Our Father's Footsteps. It also includes some reviews and interviews. It also has some information on my other books, including a new release coming out next week of a children's book about Ogopogo. The catalyst for my book was an offhand comment by Gord Stanky of Global Television. I met with a seasoned reporter to get his advice on interviewing about events that happened decades earlier. I wanted to interview people with a personal knowledge of the safety deposit vault heist I had based my first novel, Loot for the Taking, on. I had planned on writing a book about the real story. Gord was also an honorary lieutenant colonel in Edmonton and a fellow author. He has graciously written the foreword for my book. Now, I knew Gord was interested in history and had written an excellent book called Mobsters and Rum Runners of Canada. And while his book may not be about the military, I'm sure this group would find his stories about Canada and prohibition and the characters that were involved in that very fascinating. At the end of my conversation with Gord, I told him my dad's story. Howie was wounded on D-Day and lucky to survive. I told him about heading to Normandy for the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And as mentioned by Pat, it was Gord's words that started the ball rolling in writing my book. I'll always be grateful for that simple comment. It'll be great to walk in your dad's footsteps. And this picture was taken shortly after my arrival, after 16 hours, arriving in Normandy and walking on the beaches there. After returning home, I dug out my family history book. Inside, this was after my return to talk with Gord when I met with him. And inside the history book was a typed copy of a journal and letter my dad wrote from England on June 12th of 1944. Rereading these stories began a more in-depth investigation into my dad's military records. But I started by reading the section of his journal about the moment he was wounded. He made it across the beach, at Juno Beach, unscathed. Several hours later, he was on the outskirts of a town called Saint-Croix-sur-Mer. This is an excerpt from his journal. As we get close, we come under a crossfire of machine guns. By this time, I'm pretty cocky and have all the confidence in the world. I expected to be frightened a little when we came under fire, but can truthfully say that I was not. It was just like one of our exercises, but we were playing for keeps this time. I was ahead of my section, which was in the lead and on the right flank. We were in grass about a foot high, which gave us cover from the machine gun fire. I crawled up to a barbed wire fence, which was about 100 yards from the enemy slit trench. And this slit trench seemed to be about 150 feet in length, with a blockhouse on the left flank. I saw a Boche well exposed, and like a sucker raised myself to take aim. I drew a nice bead and was just squeezing the trigger when I saw a puff of smoke to my left, and a light machine gun bullet smacked me down. It hit me in the right leg and went right through the thigh from left to right. In the letter he wrote to my grandparents, written in his incredible penmanship, is a line that has remained with me my entire life. 2 inches higher, and I would have stopped being a man. That was a pretty significant moment for both my father and me. If that bullet had been 2 inches higher, or it hit a femoral artery, I would not be making tonight's presentation. That's one of the reasons the subtitle of my book is Stories of World War II Veterans, What If Moments. Several days after sending his letter home, there was an article about my dad in the Winnipeg Free Press. It talked about how he was wounded and treated in the local pubs, telling how he displayed the machine gun bullet taken from his leg. The shot had actually passed through his leg and ended up in his water bottle, and the doctor who treated him in England drilled a hole in the bullet and told him to wear it as a good luck charm. He was also interviewed by CBC as one of the first men to return from England after the invasion. I'm going to play a small, scratchy interview of my dad's return and on the radio from England.
That was on the beach too. And finally, Rifleman Jerry Levers of Winnipeg. His wound is a machine gun slug through the right thigh. I got farther in. It was about 3 miles inland. We were just going into a small town called St. Croix-le-Sur. That was our second objective. What would you say were the things you remember most about the whole show, Jerry? The way the Canadians went in. They were like a bunch of veterans who'd been under fire for 4 years. They went in standing up, even when they were going through heavy fire. It wasn't running so much as walking. We were all pretty well waterlogged from going through the water. Well, they were pretty confident, Parker?
Well, I'm sure everyone attending tonight has experienced their own what-if moments. Have you ever considered the events that preceded a traffic accident?
That was
Not just the moment before the accident, but the events of the entire day that placed you in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe one of your kids forgot to take their lunch, so you dropped it off at school. This made you late for work. Being a conscientious employee, you work late to make up for it. Ultimately, this is why you were in the middle section of this intersection when somebody ran the red light. You survived, but your car was written off. While these might be rare occurrences for you and I, for the men and women in any war, their what-if moments are a fact of life 24/7. In his book, 7 Days in Hell, Canada's Battle for Normandy and the Rise of the Black Watch Snipers, David O'Keefe eloquently summed up my thoughts as I wrote my book. He said, after the decimation of the Black Watch Regiment at Verriers Ridge, which ended with the second greatest loss of lives of Canadian soldiers in a single day, those who survived wondered about the capricious nature of fate or luck. One right or wrong move in any direction, one moment of boldness or hesitation could have spelled the difference between life and death, between a minor scratch and a maiming. Now, because my book's theme was about the what-if moments of the men in my book, I started delving into other stories of famous people who survived World War I and II. How many men who landed on Normandy's beaches never returned home? Did those who did spend the rest of their life with survivor's guilt? Did they think about those who had died who would never be fathers? What about other men and women who died throughout the war? Who knows what the unborn children of those fallen soldiers might have contributed to the world? Would the men who didn't survive have made incredible discoveries, inventions, or medical breakthroughs for our countries and the world? Would they have been doctors, inventors, statesmen, or just good fathers and citizens? How many children made contributions that would have remained unaccomplished if their fathers hadn't survived? Surely these are questions that could be asked after the conclusion of any war throughout history. A major what if was, what if Adolf Hitler was killed instead of only suffering a shrapnel wound in his leg while fighting near Bapaume, France in World War I? Would there have even been a World War II? What if famous Canadians who survived their injuries in World War I had died instead? These included men like Frederick Banting, one half of the duo of Banting and Best. These were the two men who discovered insulin. If Banting had died of his wounds at the Battle of Cambrai, would people with diabetes have the insulin they need today to live healthy lives? What if Lester B. Pearson had died when his plane crashed during his first flight in 1917? He would never become the 14th Prime Minister of Canada. Would the red and white Canadian maple leaf flag known worldwide have been different if he was not Prime Minister in 1965? There are famous Canadians who survived Second World War. And not all saw combat or landed with the troops at Normandy. Just the same, what if they didn't make it back? Would the fate of Canadian life have been different? Howie Meeker was a hockey player and legendary broadcaster. He survived a blast from a grenade. Another notable Canadian survivor of D-Day was James Doohan. His unit landed west of my dad's regiment, Bernay-sur-Mer. He served as a lieutenant with the 14th Field Artillery Regiment. Someone said fate was with him that day. After arriving on the beach under heavy enemy fire, he managed to kill 2 German snipers. However, all did not go well for the future actor. On the evening of June 6th, he was shot 6 times by friendly fire. He was hit 4 times in the left knee, once in the chest, and the 6th bullet took off the middle finger on his right hand. The shot to his chest would likely have killed him, if not for the cigarette case he had just put back in his pocket. What if the man who became Scotty had died of his wounds? Who would have kept Starship Enterprise powering through the galaxy? One of the most fascinating discoveries I made while researching my book was about an incredible, though little known event in Canada that fit perfectly into my theme of what if. It is similar to a story told by Sean Livingston in his talk about the HMCS Oakville several months ago. It was an incredible event in Canada at the time, but today there are not many people aware of what happened. The event was called If Day, and it took place on February 19th, 1942. But the seeds for this event were sown a year earlier in 1941 on February 7th. On that day, the Manitoba War Savings Program put together a performance to get its fundraising program underway. They referred to this one as the Battle of Portage and Main. This short event began at 11:30 in the morning with alarms sounding that alerted the city to approaching enemy aircraft. Streetcars came to a halt, workers scrambled from the buildings, and the 13th Field Regiment and other soldiers stood ready to do battle. The Air Force band played on as the program continued. Soon, however, the event took on a haunting tone when someone shouted gas over the loudspeaker. Moments later, the soldiers looked much less like the boys next door than an image out of a nightmare as they put on their gas masks. Well, when the all clear sounded, the soldiers formed up and marched down Main Street to their barracks. And while the event was a success, it didn't take the Manitoba arm of the National War Finance Committee long to develop a plan for its next fundraiser. In February of 42, conditions of Europe were worse than the previous. And by the end of December 41, over 280,000 men had volunteered to serve with the Canadian Army, with thousands of others, both men and women, joining the Navy and Air Force. At this point, most of the Canadian Army was still stationed in England. However, many families knew this wouldn't last and wondered if they would ever see their loved ones again. Support for the war effort had been strong, but the War Finance Committee Manitoba arm had plans for an event even more elaborate than the one staged in 1941. They wanted to bring the war to Manitoba. As an author, I've been criticized for telling about events in my stories rather than showing them. Well, the Finance Committee had the same dilemma. How do we show rather than tell people of Manitoba what is happening on the other side of the world? They must have had the attitude of go big or go home. They wanted to do something so big it could not be ignored. They wanted to give Canadians a sense of what people were going through under the Nazi occupation in other countries. There were many ad campaigns to help raise funds for the war effort. Many cities throughout North America conducted their own fundraising events. Well, just before midnight, and they asked the question of what happens if the Nazis invaded Manitoba? Well, as I started to say, just before midnight, the Royal Canadian Air Force, simulating Nazi airplanes, flew over Norway House, 450 kilometers north of Winnipeg. And this simulation began the largest military operation in Manitoba's history. And despite the day scenario being totally fabricated, the coordination and cooperation of everyone involved made this event a complete success and helped Manitoba reach its goal of $45 million. This would be equivalent to over $750 million today. This was an incredible accomplishment considering that television as we know it didn't gain popularity until the 50s, and the internet was decades away. This meant that the only real social media outlets in the 40s were newspapers, radio, and the newsreels shown in movie houses. And the average weekly wage in Manitoba in 42 was only $28.71. And the population in 41 was 730,000. So I think you would agree with me and say that Manitoba contributed more than its fair share to the war effort. Well, on February 19th, air raid sirens went off at 6 a.m. That's when soldiers from 4 Winnipeg regiments deployed to defend the city. They included troops from the 5th Field Regiment, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. My dad was a member of that cadet corps when he was young. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, and the Winnipeg Grenadiers. And after the siren sounded, soldiers left Osborne Barracks to protect the city. They already had the news that the town of Selkirk had been overrun by German forces. Anti-aircraft batteries fired hundreds of blank rounds to simulate their attempt to shoot down enemy aircraft painted with German insignia. The staged battle was fought by 3,500 Canadian soldiers in the Winnipeg area, with many volunteers posing as the overwhelming invading forces, while they were World War I veterans or young members of the Board of Trade. These men were dressed in realistic German uniforms rented from a Hollywood studio. The stormtroopers' uniforms were complete with helmets, belts, badges, and boots. And the military and local gun clubs supplied the unloaded weapons used by the invading forces. Well, as the Germans advanced, the overwhelmed defense forces retreated towards downtown, and demolition squads launched their scorched earth policy, setting off dynamite charges to destroy the local bridges and slow the enemy's advance. A deafening explosion blew river debris onto the Norwood Bridge. Smoke rose from its center supports. Officially, it was blown up and destroyed. However, the dynamite was actually placed on the ice near the bridge, but it did add realism to the day. rifle fire continued to be heard across the bridges in the early morning hours. And despite pushing the invading forces back several times, the Canadian troops waved a white flag and surrendered by 9:30 that morning. Shortly after the end of the battle, radio stations began broadcasting orders from the German command. Then, men posing as German troops lowered the flag, the Union Jack, in Lower Fort Garry, replacing it with the red, white, and black swastika Nazi flag. Armored track vehicles carrying German troops paraded through Winnipeg. It was now known as Himmelstraat. The victory parade by German forces along Portage Avenue, which was renamed Adolf Hitler Strasse, saw occupation forces riding in open track vehicles with their arms held high in a Nazi salute. The occupying forces began to run amok, arresting and imprisoning members of the Manitoba legislature, the mayor of Winnipeg, and other prominent citizens. Well, the attention to detail included radio stations broadcasting speeches by Hitler and playing martial music. A special edition of the Winnipeg Tribune had its name changed by the German occupation. Its new name was Das Winnipeger Lugenblatt, and portions of this edition were written in German. Phony Reichsmarks were handed out in place in some shops for change, and the occupation force rushed inside the Carnegie Library, which was located on William Street. These Nazi soldiers removed books from the library and threw them into a bonfire. Fortunately, these were old books scheduled to be discarded. At the time, my dad worked at the Winnipeg Grain Exchange, where effigies of Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo were hung on the walls. Even their day was interrupted by If Day. At a local church, the priest was detained by the Nazis. As one of the newsreels commented, there was no need for God. The Fuhrer is almighty now. The exercise even included German troops taking personal items out of people's homes. A curfew was implemented by a monocled German officer named Nearingburg. No national symbols except for the swastika were allowed. He restricted gatherings, enforced home billeting of German officers, and decreed that farmers supply him with a list of all livestock and grain inventories. There were decrees posted around the city proclaiming what would happen to anyone who challenged the Greater Reich's forces' authority. The 10th item on the decree includes offenses resulting in death without trial, attempting to organize resistance against the army of occupation, entering or leaving the province without permission, failure to report all goods possessed when ordered to do so, and lastly, the possession of firearms. The simulated occupation only lasted until 5:30 that evening. Then the participating groups held a parade downtown Portage Avenue, waving signs proclaiming it must not happen here or buy victory bonds. The mayor, the premier, and other officials attended a banquet to round off the event. They had nothing but praise for the day's efforts. It was judged quite a success. The visiting Norwegian minister to the US called If Day a noble, constructive action in the war against the Axis powers. As a military operation, If Day was also judged a complete success by Colonel D.S. McKay, the commander of the defensive forces. He said that the troops got more practice and benefit out of 2.5 hours of If Day maneuvers than they would get out of a week's worth of training. Nearly every major North American paper and newsreel organization covered the event, and it's estimated that 40 million people saw Winnipeg fall prey to the Nazis. Warnings have been given to neighboring US towns, as well as customs officials. They were concerned that reports of Nazi armies and nothing but Hitler on Canadian radio stations could create mass hysteria in the US, similar to the panic that took place when Orson Welles first broadcast his program, The War of the Worlds. Even public transit participated in the day's events. In an effort to encourage citizens to buy victory bonds, tickets with the caption, "This must not happen here," were handed out to customers. Below this, the ticket says, "Verboten. It is forbidden to remain seated in the presence of a German officer." Now, although Winnipeg's If Day is only a tiny part of my book, I hope it encourages everyone to learn more about it by doing a Google search. What if the day Nazis ruled Winnipeg? There you'll find dozens of articles, pictures, and YouTube features. Now, who would have thought that only days after being asked to make this presentation, the Ukraine people would be experiencing such life-changing events of their own? This sad historical moment is playing out each evening on the nightly news. Ukrainians are experiencing their own what-if moments as the Russians invade their country. Earlier, I mentioned the what-if moments of famous Canadians who survived World War II. Were you aware that the president of Ukraine is another result of a what-if moment? Zelensky's grandfather and 3 great uncles fought in World War II for the Soviet Red Army against the Nazis. According to Zelensky, the Germans executed 3 of his grandfather's brothers. He said of his grandfather, he survived World War II, contributing to the victory over Nazism and a hateful ideology. 73 years later, that man's grandson became president. What if his grandfather had been executed by the Germans? Who would be leading the David and Goliath fight against the Russians today? According to the Associated Press on February 25th, Zelensky uttered the following remark as he rejected a US offer of immediate evacuation. He's quoted as saying, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." If accurate, I believe it will be repeated throughout history with other memorable statements, like Roosevelt's speech following the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor. He referred to those attacks in his speech, and he said, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy." Well, perhaps Zelensky might be quoted alongside Churchill's incredible quote from June 4th, 1940. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Parts of my dad's story were included in Stephen Ambrose's book, D-Day, the illustrated edition. Unfortunately, the facts in my dad's diary and what Ambrose wrote were inaccurate. Firstly, he had my dad transferred from the Royal Winnipeg Rifles to the Canadian Scottish. Secondly, he had my dad writing in his diary as they headed to shore in the landing craft. He only placed it in his pocket as the landing craft got close to the beaches. Then, after hopscotching across the beach, he had my dad pull his diary out again while standing at the seawall. The thing is, there's no seawall on this section of Juno Beach. I was originally thrilled to discover my dad's story in Ambrose's book, but when I finally had the opportunity to read it, I was highly disappointed. Shortly after reading the book, my brother and I applied for my dad's military records. If you haven't asked for these before, I recommend applying for them. They can be very enlightening. My dad's records even included a questionnaire just before being discharged in 1945. As a result of seeing this record, we learned something new about my dad. He'd lied about his age on his attestation papers. Now, when we hear stories of young men lying about their age to get into the Army, we presume they're too young to enlist. There's many instances of 16-year-olds signing up. In my dad's case, I believe he felt he was too old. See, he was born in 1911, and when he went up to join in September of 39, he was 28. It wasn't his age that disqualified him then. He was disqualified because he had flat feet. Well, after Winnipeg's If Day, my dad tried to join again. This time he was successful. Now, when he signed his papers in 39 and 42, having lied, he said he was born in 1916. So according to the Army in 1942, my dad was still only 26. The physical weight and height requirements had been adjusted as the war progressed and recruitment numbers dropped. It also seemed that flat feet were no longer of great concern. Now, I have several other stories of men I want to share, but first I want to follow up on my dad's D-Day experience and his what-if moments. After being wounded near St. Croix-sur-Mer, he returned to the beach. And as he made his way back to where he landed early that morning, he helped escort German prisoners to the area with 4 other men from his regiment. Before I went to Normandy in France in 2019, I received a copy of the Winnipeg Rifles, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles nominal rolls. This was a list of the entire list of men in the regiment. It numbers over 3,000. It tells when men were sick, wounded, or died of their wounds, and who was taken prisoner. The list also includes the men killed in action. In the case of my dad's regiment, there was another note for many of the men killed on June 7th and 8th. The note was in red. The note says, "Murdered." While my dad was heading back to England, 58 men from his regiment, including 28 from A Company, his company, of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles were captured and murdered by the Hitlerjugend, or Hitler Youth of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Their names are honored on many plaques, including this one in the town of Puteaux-Basson in France. And it's the names that have the asterisks beside them that were murdered. And there were many other men murdered in other spots around Normandy. Well, I've often wondered since reading that, what if my dad wasn't wounded? Would he have been amongst those who were captured and then murdered? Would he have been with the men he helped escort the prisoners back to the beachhead with, including 2 members of the Chartrand family? They were both murdered. Was this another of my father's what-if moments? When I began working on my book, I felt there must be thousands of men and women who served in World War II, whose stories have never been told. Now, unlike other historians who interview veterans, the men whose stories I tell are no longer living. I wondered whether their stories might be tucked away in a dresser drawer in the attic or in a trunk in the basement, based on letters or journals that they might have written that haven't been looked at in generations. My book is the result of those papers and letters and journals and interviewing the families of these ordinary men. While touring this Normandy area with a group from Winnipeg, I met and spoke with dozens of people telling about the project I was working on. In St. Albert-sur-Mer, I met a family from England in the parking lot. After spending a few moments talking about the project I was working on, Marie Brown told me her dad had landed on Sword Beach with the Royal Engineers that day. Like me, she and her family were in France to learn more about her father's legacy. Several weeks after returning from France, in fact, I just looked it up the other day, it was July the 20th, 2019, that I got a wonderful email from Marie. She said, "Your plan to write a book about what ifs has given me much food for thought. I thought about your father and his what if, and the other lovely folk in your group. Did their fathers have what if moments?" Marie went on to write, "On the journey back home, we covered many miles of dreary motorway. As the family began, one by one, to fall asleep, the quietness gave me time for reflection about my father and his life. My thoughts began to stray into areas I'd rarely covered in any depth. For our fathers are our fathers. They're just there, and that is how we think of them. Much as I knew about his life, my thought process began to look back at it with a different vision. What if so-and-so had happened? How would his life have been different? My feelings strayed into several what-if moments and crossroads in his life. And as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon and we neared home, I realized I had had the opportunity to spend some quality time getting to know and understand him. For the what-if idea you planted in my head at the time, I thank you for allowing me to get to know my father better. And as a final what if we'd never met? This email would not have been written. My father would just have continued being my father, sitting in the corner reading his newspaper, and I would have forgotten the turning points in his life. Even though Marie's father, Harry Hildyard, survived World War II, his life was filled with what-if moments. George Henry Harry Hildyard was born in 1905. His first brush with death came following World War I, when the Spanish flu spread across the world. His younger sister wasn't so lucky and was amongst 228,000 people of Britain to die from one of the first true pandemics that spread around the world following World War I. After returning from his sister's funeral, his family was convinced there would soon be another, because Harry had also contracted the deadly virus. Fortunately, Harry survived, but this was just the first of his what-if moments. If he had died, he would have just been another statistic. And if he had died, I would not have had the opportunity to meet his daughter on that beach in Normandy in 2019. When the war broke out in 1939, Harry had 2 children. Jobs had been hard to come by in the 1930s, but he did get occasional work in the shipbuilding industry. Harry and his family survived the Blitz, despite Hull, the city where they lived, being one of the most bombarded cities in Britain throughout the war. Hull was a primary target for the Luftwaffe because of its value as a port and was on the road towards the steel factories in Sheffield area. Throughout the war, Hull was subjected to 815 air raid alerts and bombed on 82 occasions. 95% of the homes were destroyed, and only 6,000 out of 91,000 homes were untouched. This left 150,000 people homeless, and over 1,200 people died in the bombings. On evenings when residents believed they would be subject to more bombings, over 7,000 people would leave their homes and make their way to the countryside to camp out. It was called trekking. When the cake and flour mill at the end of Harry's block was destroyed, he moved his family to East Yorkshire to keep them safe. Harry was 37 years old now and working as a fire watcher in the docks of Hull. One of his brothers was serving with the RAF. His older brother was with the British Army, with the 8th Army in Africa. So in June of 1942, Harry finally joined the Army. His family was worried sick, and his wife felt their family was already doing their share. Nevertheless, Harry joined up and ended up serving with the Royal Engineers. What do you picture in your mind when you hear the word engineer? I'm sure many of us have specific pictures in our minds, perhaps disarming mines or other explosive charges from obstacles, breaching the seawall, removing knocked out vehicles, obstructing the beach access, and maybe even blowing up a bridge or two. In Harry's case, he was assigned to the 999th Port Operating Company. They were responsible for getting the supplies, including everything from ammunition to rations, off the arriving ships to keep the invasion moving forward. In movies like Saving Private Ryan or The Longest Day, once the 6th of June is over, that's it. The war moves inland. If you believe that, you'd be highly mistaken. It was men like Harry and those of the port operating companies who worked day and night to unload the ships. They kept the advancing army equipped with supplies needed to reach their ultimate goal of finishing the war. Like many of you, I never thought about the logistics. I never realized that Normandy's beaches were still being shelled from miles inland or bombed by the Luftwaffe for a month after the invasion. And by the end of June, the port operating company had unloaded 27 million pounds of equipment, rations, medical equipment, and ammunition. By December 31st, that total was over 212 million tons of equipment. Now, on July 6th, exactly 1 month after landing on Sword Beach, Harry experienced another what-if moment. The beaches again were subjected to shelling. Before D-Day, Harry learned that his wife was expecting their 3rd child. and after working the entire day, his shift was resting in the bivouac area. And after supper, he wandered down to the seashore, thinking about how concerned he was about his wife getting along and how she was getting along with her latest pregnancy. At 9:15 that night, the Germans once again began shelling the beach. Harry fortunately made his way to a slit trench. 40 minutes later, he emerged after the all clear. That's when he discovered that a shell had landed in his bivouac area and 15 of his mates were injured. That was the last time the unit came under fire while on Normandy Beach. Now, Harry went on to serve throughout the rest of the war and was in Holland when it finally ended. Unfortunately, he would not get home until May of 46 because he stayed on with the occupation forces and helped to get food to the people of Holland. In May of 46 was the first time he would meet his new daughter, who was now a year and a half old. There are two other stories about Canadian soldiers in the book. Jack Hamilton, whose daughter was on the trip I went to Normandy with, well, he was wounded twice, once on D-Day and the second time at the Carpiquet airport. That's when a sniper bullet shattered his Sten gun and pieces of the bullet became embedded in his eye. Remember what David O'Keefe said about one right or one wrong move in any direction, spelling the difference between life and death, between a minor scratch and a maiming? Fortunately for Jack, he recovered from his wound, but he never returned to the war. Lieutenant Johnny Nearingburg was 22 when he volunteered with the Highland Light Infantry of Canada. He was wounded in the leg outside the town of Barron 5 days after D-Day. The following month, the HLI suffered 250 casualties in the battle for Barron. Had he not been wounded after only 5 days, would he have suffered an even worse fate for the battle they called Bloody Barron? The 3 Canadians I talk about in my book all survived their what-if moments. And as a result, there are 32 direct descendants alive today. If Harry Hellyer had been killed, his wife would have been a widow. What do you think the chances of a single mother with 3 children getting remarried after the war would probably have been slim? Another huge question is, what if the landings had failed? What would have happened if D-Day had not been successful? How much longer might the war have continued? General Eisenhower wrote a letter taking blame in case the invasion failed. The writing is almost illegible, and Eisenhower must have been extremely nervous when he wrote it, because you'll notice at the bottom of the page, it's dated July 5th. Here's what it says. Our landings in the Cherbourg area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold and have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. As one final what if the landings had failed? Would Eisenhower become the 34th president of the United States? Thank you. Are there any questions?
Now is your time. Anybody got any questions? That was quite the presentation, Don.
Thank you.
No?
Well, I did mention earlier that if you were interested, I have some information on the famous picture on the cover of my book. And when I found this picture, I always questioned the provenance of the picture itself. Library and Archives Canada lists this picture as being from June 6th, from D-Day. Canada Post did a stamp with this picture on it, declaring it to be from D-Day. But if you look at the sea behind the men in the boat here, you'll see how calm it is. The men in this landing craft all have their heads sticking up above the gunnels of the boat. This man is wearing a beret, not a helmet. These other two men are wearing the invasion helmets that were issued them shortly after, before the invasion. They ended up being called turtle helmets. Well, while doing some signings and book signings and interviews, I was contacted by family members of these two gentlemen. This gentleman here was with the B Company. His name was Alan Williams, and he was a rifleman. He was wounded 10 minutes after landing on the beach with B Company. And B Company landed with an oversized company of 164 men. They were still being shot at, or they were being shot at 700 meters from shore as they were heading in. And after fierce fighting on the beach, it was only their CO, Captain Gower, 28 men, and 4 stretcher bearers to leave, who left the beach. So if this is taken on the morning of June 6th, this man would have been within the first wave, and the seas would have been in the 6-foot swell area. The man wearing the beret was Rifleman H.M., called Morley Douglas. He was a signalman, a radio operator. He was injured twice, once at the Battle for the Carpe Cay Airport along with Jack Hamilton, and the second time on February 21st, 1945. Well, I now believe, and actually Morley's son told me that this picture was probably taken during Operation Fabius, which was done in May. That's why he wasn't wearing a helmet. That's why the sea is so calm. So we're trying to find out the exact provenance of this picture, and we have some people looking into it a little further. I've been trying to identify some of the other men in the picture, including this man here, who Morty told his son that this man was one of the snipers with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. So I'm hoping that at some point we can prove the provenance of this picture and perhaps solve a 78-year-old mystery.
I believe that Diane Maddox has a question for you, Don. Go ahead, Diane.
Two things, Don. One, thank you so much for reinforcing there's no glory in war, the glories in sustainable peace. And the history in Canada is extremely important, especially now, in my personal opinion. This is a fantastic presentation, and again, thank you. Have you been in touch with any of the school boards where you live, or in any of the communities Canada-wide, to at least do one presentation a year?
I'm hoping to do something. I was hoping to do something for the Legion's convention in Saskatchewan this coming fall, but they were already booked up. So I have been working to get some talks at schools. I'm hoping to be able to do that. And I was hoping to also do a tour of the Northern Lights library system here in Alberta. And because of COVID and the way things are, they still haven't got back into that. So I do hope to travel to some legions, and I've put my name out there as willing to go to schools to talk about them. Because one of the goals for writing my book was to encourage young people to take an interest in their family's military history and to find out where they were at various times in their service. And very fortunately, we have wonderful records in the archives of the regimental war diaries. And I was able to follow these men from the beginning of June right through to the end of August, day by day, and see what the regimental war diary said about it. So I'm encouraging young people to find out more, and also to encourage people that had family members that were over there, whether it be now in some cases great-grandfathers, to take a trip to Normandy and realize how lucky we are to be alive today. The 4 men in my story are all very lucky that they survived, meaning the fact that I'm here tonight making the presentation.
Pat, can you hear me?
Thank you again.
Pat, it's Fraser McKee. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I have a question. Don, it's an excellent story. I write naval history. It's the same period. Have you, in your people that you're looking at, the individuals, have you any idea of how many of them stayed involved with the military after the war, which if they hadn't been involved before, they joined up either in the reserves or in the regular force? I heard from one, well, he was a colonel when I was in touch with him in about 1970, who landed that day with the Regiment de la Chaudière on the extreme east end of the invasion. And it was fascinating to get his particular story of his LCA landing on the beach there, simply because it was, as you say, he happened to survive, and I was able to talk to him. It was absolutely miraculous. I've lost his name, which really bothers me, but that's a great thing. But do you know any others that stayed with the military?
None of the four men that this story is about did. I have a story of the grandfather of a young man that worked for me who was serving on the ships and was there on D-Day on one of the ships that were shelling the beaches. And I didn't have enough room in this book to write that one, but I'm looking for more stories to be able to tell, not just D-Day, but perhaps the Italian campaign, the Seaforth Highlanders, or the PPCLI. In fact, my dad was seconded to the PPCLI and left Europe early to come home and train to go to Japan. At that time, he was assigned to the PPCLI and probably would have gone to Japan if we had gone over there. Fortunately, we never had to. So, but none of the four men in this story did. And but I know many who did. The chap in the Navy, he spent 30 years in the Navy. So Jim Parks wrote the on the front, he gave me a review of the book, and it was one of the most flattering that I'd received. And he said that I wrote it as though I was there, and Jim was there. He's one of the last surviving members of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. So it was a real honor to get an endorsement like that.
Very much so.
And if anybody here knows of anyone that has these letters, like the lady from Johnny Nearingburg's daughter gave me 150 letters that he had written home before heading over to Normandy. And to read those, you would think he was just there doing some exercises and things that he couldn't talk about, but talked about the parties and the flowers and the tennis and all kinds of different things that they went through. But that's what made this story personable for me. And I felt that after I'd finished them, I could have probably sat down and had a beer with any one of these guys.
It gives you a great feeling. My father wrote home twice a week from December 1939 when he went overseas, and then he was all through the Italian campaign, and right till the time he came home, which is in February 1945, he wrote home twice a week. And I have all those letters, which give you a picture of training, give you a picture of the weather of the day, and then the fighting all the way up through Sicily and Italy. That's the kind of thing that sure helps. And they're around, or they presumably are around. It's getting your hands on them, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if anybody does know somebody that has those, and I know there's a few of the people watching tonight that have family members that they're watching in from the US. And if they have family members that have those kind of letters, I'd love to follow up with those. And because it isn't just a Canadian story, it was a worldwide story. And that's why meeting Marie Brown on the beaches of France was just wonderful. And in 3 years, we've become excellent friends and email each other regularly. So like I say, I'm looking for more stories. If somebody would like to reach out to me, they can contact me at leversdawn@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to start a conversation and see where we can go with starting on the next, because it probably take me another couple of years to get the next book done. So.
Well,
I've got
Dawn, sorry, Pat? Dawn, I'm sure you're aware my husband was a World War II veteran with Royal Marine Commandos. And so I just wanted to clarify, are you looking for Canadian specific or all nations?
No, all nations. And as I say, the story that I got from Marie, her dad was with the Royal Engineers. So again, and Jack Hamilton, his story is actually being told in a new production that they're doing in a movie called Juno to Coteau about the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. So yes, I'm looking for getting those family letters and getting a picture of these men, because what I also did, it isn't just the actual moments. I've added dialogue to these men to make it more readable for a lot of readers rather than just being a factual book. And Marie comment on the fact that I managed to get her dad's voice, that she could almost hear him speaking. Jack Hamilton. Yeah, sure can.
I'm sorry, Pat, just one more comment, because this is, it's just so important. You're probably aware too that I'm constantly promoting the cadets in our military. And about 17 years ago, I pushed to have the cadets back into the schools so that there were peer group role models. And I'm sharing this with everybody so that you're aware what can happen with stories like Dawn's when they escalate to to elevate the communities nationwide. It only takes one or two, and grassroots is really important. So with them going back into the schools, the first 3 years tracking them in the GTA, they actually reduced the juvenile crime rate by 50%. And I spent 5 years around Canada, again, talking to school grassroots, because you don't know who knows who, about getting the cadets back into the schools. And when I came out to BC, I saw they were active in the schools nationwide. And most people didn't know that I initiated that, or that my husband was one of the 5 founding directors of the Army Cadet League. But I've seen positive results. And so when you mention the cadets, that's why too I'm coming back to suggest that while you're looking at the Legion Convention, the cadets are all at the higher level, at least, aware of the school program, and that may give you a more expedited venue to look at, to get the history there, because many families are not initially interested in their dad's work. And the World War II vets, there are very few partners still around. And don't, I maybe encourage people to videotape the descendants that have shown an interest, which is what I did for my late husband's family, because they weren't interested in his life at all. But on a higher level, just remember that what you're doing at grassroots, that will have national ramifications in a very positive light. There's so many people that don't know our history, and they need to know that. So again, Dawn, thank you.
Well, Diane, if you'd like to reach out to me at my email, I'd love to talk to you about it. There's even a Facebook page now, Army Cadet History. And that I follow now, and I've made connections with some old cadets that I was involved with in the 70s. So it's absolutely wonderful. But please reach out to me and send me an email, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about that.
Thank you.
One of the things that does affect this attitude is the 3 leagues: the Army Cadet League, the Navy Sea Cadet League, the Navy League of Canada, and the Air Cadet League. They're very careful not to be seen as recruiting depots for the reserves of the regular force. They want the association, but they still worry that the families will consider, oh, well, they're just trying to recruit them, get them into the Army or the Air Force or the Navy. And the leagues are very careful not to do that. And that's why your kind of connection is very important, because although the leagues are not a recruiting depot for those 3 forces, a knowledge of them through such things as that is very important to give people in Canada a connection to what these people went through during that war and the first war too, as well.
Absolutely, because my granddaughter is 11 now, and my goal is to take her to Normandy for the 80th anniversary. because it's important for her to realize, and her other grandfather served with the PPCLI and has just retired from there. So I think it's important for the young people to realize just how lucky we are. When I was in France, we were treated so royally, and then watching the young people that came out to the ceremonies that we had and were aware of exactly what happened. We aren't aware of that in Canada. And that's why I also said that I don't think them as a training ground for a new generation of soldiers. I think of the cadets as a training ground for a new generation of upstanding citizens. And I think that's important to remember.
Exactly.
Good. I'd like to just share a little story. My uncle was rescued from Dunkirk, and it made me think, what if he hadn't been rescued? How would my life and my aunt's life and the family's life been different? But he was rescued and from Dunkirk, and when they got off the boat, the king gave them 48 hours leave, and the people gave them a postcard. All they had to do was put the name and address, because it was all written on, arrived safely, and they just posted them off. But and then of course he went into the Middle East. She didn't see him again for another 2 years. But it just made me think, what if he had not been rescued at that time from Dunkirk? So many lives would have been changed.
Absolutely. And in fact, Marie Brown passed on a story about 3 of her first husband's family members. They were all 3 brothers in different regiments on Dunkirk. Mm-hmm. And they all somehow miraculously met up on Dunkirk. And from these different regiments, 2 of them got away and one of them was wounded and captured. But 2 of them had swum out to one of the small boats that had come in. So that story is in there. You might appreciate it, Pat, when you get a chance to read the book. Yeah. It's about these 3 brothers. And they were, again, like you say, the lives that would have been changed that is hard to imagine.
Yeah. I know my aunt told me, she said she was working and she received the news that her husband had, my uncle had, arrived safely. And I guess the boss said to her, "It's no good asking you to stay for work doing any more, Mrs. Marshall. You may as well go home." Because she was excited about her husband being rescued. Yeah.
Well, I certainly hope the English government paid for the stamps. One of the things I found while researching is
they were already stamped. Yes.
Well, the soldiers that were wounded and something I found while I was researching and had a copy of the wound. It was a wound card that was sent home to. It was basically a postcard talking about their wounds for Canadian soldiers, and they had to tick off certain things. Couldn't write on the cover, but they also had to pay for the stamp. So I was very disappointed with the Canadian government for not covering the cost of their stamps.
So, any more questions? Anybody? Now's your last chance. No.
If anybody's interested in the book, it's not available in all the bookstores. It's in the Edmonton area here. It's available on Amazon.com in the States and at Amazon.ca in Canada here. So if anybody's interested in reading more about the stories themselves, I'd be pleased if you buy one of the books.
Oh, good. Well, I intend to read it. But anyway, thank you, Don, for, what I was saying, outstanding, very thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Mutual. At this time, I would like to present you with a thank you gift, but, it's not possible. So I'm going to leave Canada Post to do the job for me.
Don't forget to put the stamps on.
This has been another in our series of webcasts provided by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public education service. You can find news of upcoming events and link to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Stephen Dieter bidding you farewell for now, and thank you for joining us.